Okay, testing 1, 2, 3. Try that again. Hey, Sapha, we're having audio issues on my end, so can the two of you talk? Okay, it seems to be. It's not picking up the computer audio. Okay. Do you guys well, I have an audio. It's like just jumping me way high. I have audio input capture, which is okay. But I don't think that the audience can hear us. So just a bit important. Okay. Just a second. Um, can you repeat that, please? Sorry. Okay. So let me add an audio output device. Huh? Okay. Ah. Um, okay. So when you were capturing the input from Discord, how did you get the audio on? Oh, they can hear us now. Well, can you hear all of us? Okay. Okay. That's so audio output
To
capture.
go set for different things, but yeah.
Okay,
And for myself, I have my solo microphone, my NTA for me, but for people on Discord that I have on the screen, that I just do the iMac speaker capture
okay. So I think this
for
might
now.
be working now.
Yay!
I'm seeing audio
All
for
right.
both of us. So can we
Excellent. And are
try?
they coming up to
All
approximately
three?
equal levels?
I'm getting that me and Sapphire are definitely coming in. Heather, can you talk again?
Testing, testing. 1, 2, 3.
Yep, Heather is coming through. Okay. Thank you for bearing with my first time trying this technology.
Thank you so much, Starshine Rhapsody. Do you mind if we go back to the beginning and pretend that we didn't start the first time?
I'm missing visuals here. Where is this on your disc? Is this on your Twitch already, or?
Yes, we are streaming on
Okay.
Twitch. We went live at 10:10, but with technical difficulties, so we're just gonna start this all over again.
Okay. Let me just go to the Twitch.
Let me get, I'm
I
gonna
have it.
just get us a little bit. Sorry, I'm resizing to better fit the screen, and then do that. Okay.
So it's a triad. I have Sapha over here and Celinda down there. Is that correct?
Yes.
Can you just send me the link real quick? I've got everything on my screen and I'm having trouble finding you, Belle.
No worries.
Then,
Maybe I can get this. See, it's wonderful when you do this stuff live because then you get to work through all of this.
with an audience, which just makes it so much more relaxed.
it's okay. I'll do a little like distraction dance. Look over
I
here.
really
Look over here.
wish that Twitch has had a stealth broadcast mode where it doesn't announce to everybody what you think you're doing.
There we go. I got it.
Okay. Sorry. Cool.
There we go. We're good. We're good.
All right. So welcome to our panel discussion on content warnings. The reason why I wanted to bring together this wonderful group of writers and industry professionals to talk about content warnings is twofold. One, I'm starting a series on what do you put into an actual novel or a book? Because we've sat down, we've written it, we've had it edited, and now we're looking at, do we want to traditionally publish it or do we want to self-publish it? But even then, there's a lot of things that go into it, dedications and content warnings and all of these different things. And we're starting out with content warnings because one, I could get the lovely panel members to come and share their opinions. And also because recently I was reading a book. It was a YA fiction, and it had a very detailed content warning, and I felt after reading it that I was prepared for the content of the book. But when I hit that section about which the content warning was about, I had to stop reading. I even had to skip over pages because the detail of which the content was in the book was more than I could handle as a reader, even having been forewarned. And so I wanted to talk about why we include these things, why it matters, what's a good example of a content warning, what's best practices, and also when it's not necessary. Because each book is unique and each book needs to have these issues addressed. And I have the author of Missing the Boat here. She has an amazing content warning and did a great job of a physical book content warning. And so we're going to start with Heather Adams and her opinion on this subject.
Thank you very much, Celinda. For me, consent is a very important concept, and that includes the concept of bystander consent. If you go to a football game and somebody starts playing softball in the middle of the field, you might feel reasonably betrayed because you consented to watch a football game and you're getting something that's not at all what you expected. When picking up a book, we go into it with certain expectations based on the genre, certain expectations based on our previous reading. And sometimes we go in not quite sure what to expect. If we are going to do something unexpected, for example, if we're going to interrupt our halftime at football game for a quick softball demo because we want to push softball this year, we should probably let people know ahead of time, because if we don't, as you experienced, they might find their reading experience disrupted. They might find themselves distressed. Some people call these sorts of warnings trigger warnings, and it is absolutely vital for people who are in treatment for PTSD to be able to navigate around triggers in their environment. It's not just about PTSD-like symptoms, though. When I pick up something to read for enjoyment, there are certain things that will make the reading experience less comfortable for me. Even if I have the option, as you said, Celinda, to skim over those pages and go, okay, is it over yet? Is it over? Come on, it has to be over yet. That is pulling me out of the story and doing me harm in my relationship with the book. I don't want that to happen to my readers. If the material in my book is something that would be distressing or uncomfortable for you, It's just a fun novel to read for pleasure. This isn't great literature that's meant to challenge you where you live. So I put, as you said, right up front, I know not everyone believes they need sensitive content advisories, which is the title that I eventually went with. So what I did was I had the 2 pages of warnings on facing pages. So if you do not want a sensitive content advisory, you can just turn 2 pages at once. And on my sensitive content advisory, I did say, if you're more comfortable here, I'm sorry. This book contains mature themes, which is a lovely warning that tells you absolutely nothing. And this is true, I think, even if you're familiar with the content labels on AO3 or somewhere like that, where they give you one word, like this book contains kink, would tell you very little, because kink is a broad range of things that means different things to different people. So for me, in order to get informed consent from my readers, I put this information right up front. I gave, for example, kink, a brief explanation of what I meant by that, and a short blurb that showed how I handled it. This is designed, and I hope it works, for people who are not entirely sure they trust me yet. And this is my first publication, so why would people trust me? Some things you can read about if it's portrayed in one way and not another. So for me, I went full force on the sensitive content advisory to give the label, what I meant by that label, and an example in context. And I hope that's proved helpful for readers.
Thank you so much, Heather. So, Sapha, I asked you onto this panel because you had an amazing statement on your own stream where you talked about how some things are just genre tropes, and so you expect them to show up in that literature, and you don't necessarily need content warnings for genre-specific tropes, but that when those tropes are found outside of the context of whatever the story or genre is, that there very much needs to be this kind of content warning idea. So please.
All right. So first off, I'd like to say I don't have content warnings in any of my 3 books that are published to this point. It is something that we are considering doing in the future, but it's not something that we have done, especially when you're thinking, my publishing goes back 10 years. And even in this last decade, content warnings have grown immensely. So I did write a little something to prepare for this. So, and I know it's about 5 minutes worth of talking, so I hope that's okay. While some writing is meant to be safe and a comfortable place for a reader, this is not always the case, nor should it be. Part of this discussion belongs to genre and expectation. Like you said, you can get away with gore and horror, which would be inappropriate for the YA or NA crowd. When we have prominent authors writing incestuous relationships, red weddings, scenes of sexual violence, and racist characters, where are those lines? It seems some authors can get away with content in their stories without major warnings, and other people can't, while the line remains arbitrary. And I think, too, we have to kind of take a difference between content warning and trigger warning, because ultimately triggers are subjective. So it's up to the author, I think, to be open in their synopsis, just like Heather said. Heather has basically a content warning for her book, because you know what? For something where with a lot of people could have a lot of misconceptions about the kink community and different things like that, it is necessary to define terms. And they say that a lot in our editing streams, you've got to define those terms. And so I think for a book which is dealing with certain issues and certain kind of challenges that people could have, absolutely, you know what, maybe a bit of a content check at the beginning, that could be a really good thing. I think if we're reading something within a genre where certain tropes are allowed, then maybe it's not as necessary. But it's up to the author to be open in their synopsis and promotional material about potentially damaging material. If the crux point of a novel is the sexual abuse of the main character, that should not be shied away with the whispers of spoilers. Some readers will choose to steer away from that certain content. That is their prerogative. We should be honest about certain large-scale things in our fiction. If a solid job in the descriptions of the work is done, the average reader, and even the traumatized one, has the knowledge to look away without a big red sticker. Readers have the option of putting a book down. Triggers in PTSD, which is the origin of trigger warnings, are unpredictable. Is it our job to be safe or to tell convincing, challenging stories? For me, it depends upon what happens with the content itself. How explicit is it? Is it a casual mention, an intimation, or visceral part of the prose? Why does the prose require such moments in the first place? Is it part of an evil to be defeated or an inner fear which is resolved over time? Is it pure shock value to prove how edgy and reckless the author is? While I do agree some potentially upsetting elements in a story should be visible to potential readers, I don't believe we should hold adult readers' hands. I say adult there because I think in the children's lit and YA market, there is a certain responsibility to make things very clear that you don't necessarily have to do to the same extent for the adult population. So some professors at Harvard did a trigger warning study, an empirical evidence study on trigger warnings. And I've got a link if anybody wants to read the study. It showed a marked increase in participants who received trigger warnings, feeling vulnerable, believing in the harmfulness of their words, and reporting a greater anxiety as opposed to those people who read the exact same passages without warnings. In the study, the trigger warnings themselves appeared to cause harm. The Harvard conclusion was that trigger warnings undermine emotional resilience and may increase anxiety and stress, and further study is needed to determine the appropriate role of trigger warnings in literature. Guy Boson evaluated the logic of trigger warnings and studied whether they are consistent with existing clinical literature on PTSD. People with PTSD, only about 10% of the people who experience trauma by population, and that's also diagnosed PTSD, do face automatic symptoms with re-experiencing trauma, which can happen with external factors like content and media. If we're putting trigger warnings in our work to protect the part of the population who could be in potential distress, we can't necessarily protect enough. Often in trauma, it is the moment before the event which is a trigger, and at other times, a trigger could be anything. There is no guarantee we can mention enough to protect someone who could be distressed. Avoidance behaviors are known in psychological circles to make PTSD worse. So we have to kind of think, how far do we go here? And I know there's a difference between trigger warning and content warning, but I know content warnings are not as extreme. I do think authors should be open about things in their fiction before someone picks up the book. But we also have a right to be able to write potentially unsafe things. John Gardner posits on moral fiction that art is instructional regardless of its intent. Thus, it can be argued we have an ethical or moral obligation to be aware of the messages in our work. And maybe that's the crux of it. It seems content or trigger warnings become more potentially necessary when media is prolific. While there are certain themes in literature I willfully ignore, like I'm not going to pick up a book on certain things just because that's not my jam and I would like to know. And I have been kind of hit with it in the past where I got some review books sent to me by the publisher, and the only reason I kept reading the book, which was incredibly traumatic, was because I needed to do a professional review. There was no indication on any of the promotional material that there were such visceral things, and one of them was a book about refugee women dealing with rape, the dismemberment of children in front of them, the horrors of war. And I believe a book with that visceral, suicidal kind of tendencies within the characters of the story, that absolutely needed a content warning. Absolutely. You're not going to put somebody through that with explanations of this is a beautiful work of women's literature, of women helping women. And then you have that and you hit us in the face with it. Whereas at the same time, if you're in some sort of magic realism adventure and the villain does evil things, well, you expect the villain to do evil things. We're not supposed to write about necessarily always about good people and kittens. So where's the line there, and how visceral of an image is it? I'll close with this and I'll stop. But while there are certain themes in literature I believe require revelation before somebody reads the book, I believe that those revelations are sufficient without a big red sign. But if an author hides the fact, like I'm going to use my book as an example because I can. In Son of Abel, the villain is a racist bastard who's defeated by the protagonist, Caleb. But Caleb recognizes while he will fight to defeat this evil, justice is not his to take. It's is that worthy of a label which could potentially get me completely canceled and banned for the rest of my life, when it's a story of a big, gigantic, authoritarian white guy realizing that this racist bastard he needs to get rid of needs to be defeated, but also that justice does not belong to him, that justice belongs to the people that were hurt by this guy. And so here's Caleb, who takes his role as judge very seriously and then steps aside and allows those who really, he allows himself to step away and not be part of that justice, because that's not his place. His place is to support those who really require that support. So do I put a major content warning of a certain kind on that book, or do I rely on the fact that we are using this image as a defeat of evil, purposefully to show and to educate what kind of evil exists in the world and how we are supposed to take care of it? I guess it can be a little tricky. And then again, if it was a visceral thing, then obviously, yeah, I guess there does need to be some form of warning, but I don't necessarily think that we have to kind of warning on everything. It's not in the literature. It's not something that has been seen as helpful as much as people think it is. Yeah, anyway.
Awesome, great
I'll
points.
Mm-hmm.
So I know for me personally as a writer, I kind of have an issue with this because I received one of my very few comments on one of my books that the person didn't trust me enough to finish the story because they felt that it was too violent for science fiction. Yeah, that's where my brain went, Sapha. And one of my other few comments on this title was that there was a disconnect between the playful nature of the characters and the body count.
Have they not seen Buffy?
Novel. Huh?
Have they not seen Buffy?
Look, red shirts don't count, okay?
like a ship gets blown up in the middle of a rescue. I'm spoiling some of my own plot, right? It happens at the very beginning of the book, but you've read it, so Heather, I trust your opinion on it. And yes, I have red shirts. I have a lot of red shirts. A lot of people end up dead in my stuff. I like to think of it as, very Star Trek, Star Wars type mingling universes on that same line. And for me, it's genre specific. And so I didn't include any content warnings or anything like that, because I think that if you're picking up a book and, the last starfighter, then you expect that starfighter to be shooting at things. And the damage that causes.
I guess, too, for me, it would also depend on, if they're thinking that if the ship is blowing up and, it's the whole thing, the death of one person is murder, the death of 1,000 is a tragedy, and
the death of 1,000,000 is a statistic.
Yeah, pretty much. And if you're blowing up that ship and showing every single potential bit of blood and the viscera and the way that, oh, there goes Lewis's organs, I think I see the liver. Like, if you're going into detail of, the decomposition of bodies in the middle of space as everything's blowing up, then that might require some little bit, like maybe you're closer to horror. Let's just talk. Maybe that's a little bit more like
moisture in space for decomposition, is there?
No, there's freezing, I know, but yeah. I think they'd probably
if
desiccate
you're going to show
more
the
likely.
Decomposition of the organs in space, get it right, darn it.
I mean, I want to see some form of nebula that is ended up formed by the destruction of the ship. I want to see like the slow kind of. Well, then again, if things in space, because there's no friction, well, practically no friction due to gravity, due to the vacuum of space, then they pieces and bits would continue moving unaided. They're just, there goes, there goes Bob's head as it's just kind of like, for all of eternity until it hits something. There is violence. I think, though, too, it goes back to if we've done what we've done to write our descriptions. And, obviously there's Neon Leben is a little violent. Trigger warning. It's violent. It can be. I mean, this is a story about super soldiers who end up trying to save the world. Like, of course, there's going to be violence in there. But I wonder a little bit, too, when it comes to content warnings and things, who is the gatekeeper? Where is the standard? This is not like film where if you have X amount of swear words and X amount of seconds of certain kinds of content, you have to give it a different rating. There is no such thing in books. I mean, there are certain regulations and things like that are supposed to be fairly normalized for, say, children's lit. Certain things that you're supposed to steer away from. But if anybody grew up reading Obasan, that doesn't exactly happen very often.
Well,
but, I would wonder about that reader.
I add to that, right? So the book that I was originally talking about, it was a YA book. It was a retold fairy tale, and it was about a girl in transition to womanhood and her re-empowerment after going through a rape experience. And the trigger warning, content warning at the beginning of the book, said there is rape talked about in this. It is a central part of the book, and if you've experienced this, here's places and things you can go to. And that, to me, was totally fine. Mm-hmm. It was as the plot was developing and I was invested in the story and the characters and the development of the book, that there was this very graphic description of the rape scene to the point that I have to admit this as a reader, it was causing sexual responses in me. And I don't want to be sexually responsive to a rape scene. That just messed with my internals.
I would wonder then with that author, what was the purpose of putting that in there? And I think this happens too when we edit. There's a point where writers will probably go there and write all that stuff, but that doesn't mean it has to be in the final product. It can inform the way that the characters function. It can inform the plot, but eventually you need to grab that red pen and think, is this here for some reason, or is it just here as shock value? Is it just here because I've thought about it and this is my research? And also too, that author, I would wonder, have they gone through an experience like that? Do they know what they would be potentially putting people through? Have they talked to anybody who is a survivor of sexual violence or sexual abuse? If the answer is no, I wonder why you think you are the one to write a story about that. But that gets us into a completely different kind of argument.
Yeah. So, any thoughts, Heather?
I will point out, Celinda, and you may wind up editing this out, but
hey, we're live.
I will point out that the physiological response that you noticed while reading, people often frame as being an arousal response when it is absolutely not. Mm-hmm. This is a problem that has occurred in some of the research around it. People respond physically in that way when there is a threat of sexual violence, because overall bodies that respond in that way reduce injury.
Yeah.
It by no means indicates that you were enjoying the material, but there is much framing in the culture to which we belong that says that if you're experiencing certain physiological responses, you are turned on, you must like it, you are a bad person. Oh, heck no, I'm putting this book down.
Which is a shame, because it had beautiful prose, gorgeous characters, a wonderful world build, and I was really enjoying the book and its view
Yeah.
into recovery from an experience like that. Because this was about someone recovering, and I really wanted to experience that. So, so that's why for me, I'm really torn, right?
Well,
Getting
it would have
those.
been that author, if that author had used, I don't know this book, so obviously I'm just using my opinion, but it seems like that author let go of their sense of tact. If this is a book about recovery, why do we need to absolutely be confronted with a very visceral play of events? Is it part of recovery to have to relive it? Well, it's definitely something that happens with trauma. And to go along with what Heather was saying too, as a self-defense instructor, I've seen it time and again with girls, I say specifically cisgendered women, because that's the only population group that I've seen it with in my experience, that the guilt around sexual feelings and things like that, when you're training certain situations and different things like that, can sometimes be paralyzing. And it is our culture, and it is also that, instinctual desire not to be harmed, that comes into it. And it's not something which is like, oh, wow, what a wonderful scene. No, it's a self-preservation moment, which gets skewed by our, cultural reliance on sexual feelings and different kinds of pleasure, the kind of sexualization of culture in a way. So, but yeah, I would wonder why the author felt like they needed to have that there. Is it to make it more real? Well, I don't need it to be real. Thank you. This is fiction. I don't read fiction. If I wanted something to feel that visceral and that real, I would read a nonfiction accounting of somebody getting through their trauma. Thank you. I read to escape when I'm not doing research writing, and I think most of us do. And yet, while again, I don't believe that all writing should be safe, I do believe that the reader needs to kind of go into something kind of knowing what they're expecting. Like maybe if you pick up a gigantic space science fiction novel about starships and some form of navy, that there may potentially be a battle. Just
Go figure.
hot take. There might potentially be some conflict. That conflict might also include some butting heads,
Especially when it's military SF.
I
don't think Celinda mentioned this about the book, but the book that had too much violence and did not actually include the corporeal confetti about which we were speculating was military SF and clearly labeled as such.
But oh, good. Okay, so that was clearly just a person that went a little bit too far, I think.
And I mark my work, like I don't mark my work as clean, because it is military science fi, and I don't know where the line is for that. But I purposely have no swear words in any of my work. I work within that sphere of not wanting to have that content in my books. So I just kind of felt it was odd.
I do have swear words in my book, but I also very seriously do not market them to any form of teenage or younger market. There have been many people who expect that because it's science fiction, oh, that's pretty stuff. Like, oh yeah, my 14-year-old would love science fiction. And I have to be like, okay, so, great. How old are they? Oh, they're 14. You know what? It's going to be a few years before they're ready for my book. Oh, really? Well, what's wrong? Like, well, there's nothing wrong. It's just I write for a trade market. I write for an adult market. You're allowed to write for the market you want. And that's part of knowing your fiction and part of being able to present your fiction. If you're presenting it with, a whole bunch of TikToks with glitter and something else and a crazy dance while you're holding your book aloft, well, then a 13-year-old is probably going to want to try and pick it up. But if you're marketing it within the sort of realm of experience of your ideal reader, and I say that term loosely, but then if somebody has, it's like we said this a couple months ago in stream, how do you handle a bad review? Well, the first thing I do is look at the demographic of the person who gave it. If I'm getting a terrible review on Neon Lieben from somebody who exclusively reads historical romance novels. They're going to lambaste Neon Leaving within an inch of its life. They're going to give it 0.0 stars, and they're going to find everything wrong with that book. But it's a cyberpunk adventure with transhumanist themes and super soldiers made out of Tinker Toy DNA. Like, it's clearly not a historical romance novel.
Yes.
So who
It's
are
a
the
very, very bad historical romance novel that hits none of the tropes.
there's no bodice busting, there's no plucky female empowered character that somehow ignores proper clothing and instead just refuses to wear a corset because corsets are evil, even though there's just a simple piece of
They're a
undergarment.
bra.
It's yeah.
They're the period bra, and they actually are valuable
Except they
bra
don't use
replacements.
the same way.
Well, also too, I'm sorry, if you don't have the appropriate understructure, your garments won't fit.
Yeah.
You won't be able to wear the dresses. And if you look at historical costuming, you look at historical clothing, it's more about the silhouette, it's more about the proportions, which was usually done by a mixture of padding.
Yep.
But anyway, total aside, if yeah,
because it's not like we don't have modern padding in the form of Brazilian butt lifts and so on and so forth nowadays.
Different structured garments which contain some form of foam or silicone or if you go to the extreme nowadays, it's like, oh, no, you don't have to wear a corset with certain kinds of padding, you just have to have plastic surgery.
Yep.
Thank you for being here, Rune Ryder.
Thanks, Rund. Hope to see you soon. Anyway, I mean, content warning on there, maybe. I think too, depending on the reader's lens, something that we would see as innocuous could be incredibly horrific.
Yeah.
But the question becomes, is it up to the author to check with every viewpoint on the globe to make sure that their work is inoffensive? Or is it up to the author to be honest about the content and let people make of it what they will? I think it gets a little bit close to that idea that if something is potentially problematic, and those words can be, an inflammatory thing on their own nowadays, that it somehow no longer has a place. But we both need to be challenged by a story, but we also need to remember that a story is entertainment. If you want to write something to educate, a story is a good way to do it, because every single book is a form of education in one way or another. I really, I've got my copy right here, but on Moral Fiction by John Gardner, I agree with the fact that every story, regardless of its original intention being written, is a form of education. It is a form of instruction. So then what do we, it's up to us to look at our works and to see, what are we instructing? What is the point? With something like Heather's book, it is an incredibly beneficial instructional manual wrapped in a story about women in various stages of their lives. Women in non-binary and, the whole gamut, but I'm not trying to be binary here, but
there aren't enough men in it. If the Bechdel test were gender reversed, this book would fail. There are two males, each gets approximately one line, and they don't talk to each other.
Nice.
That would do it.
But that's fine. The men have lots of other books.
They do, and like, I've read part of yours. Like, I haven't read the whole thing yet. I've been incredibly busy, but I will get to it. I will read it, but it's on my list. It is an incredibly positive instructional document, and something that I think that anybody who tries to trend towards, the trend of things like kink and things like that, they desperately need it. And I think that, I know the other day, somebody likened your work to that series, which shall not be named, the horrificon of awfulness, I think it was more about that person not knowing any other source to look at. And so they were like, well, it's like this. Well, no, it's not, because that's full of abusive, gross, and terrible things that
And
should never
literal rape,
happen.
yes.
Yes. You
Literal
know,
rape with no content advisory.
yeah. So like, actually, this is completely different, but it's the education of the person that basically needs to, they're ignorant. And readers will always make allusions to other books when they read our work.
Especially popular books.
Because it's more likely they've read a popular book than something obscure on Goodreads with 2 reviews and 7 people that have ever viewed the page. It's just, odds are.
It's also more useful communication.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
I will say, though, this is an instructional manual. This is a work of fiction. Please don't confuse the two.
Yeah. When I say that all work is instructive, I don't necessarily mean that everything's a textbook, but I do believe people will learn something from everything they read. They will pick up on some form of.
I was going to go back to your comment about children's literature and how that. So, and Dr. Seuss. If any of you guys have read Dr. Seuss books, especially as adults, they are so instructive. Like, the Zooks and the Sneetches and their stars, and even Horton Hears a Who is like that idea of what makes a person. Like, is it size or demographics? And one of the ones that just like popped into my head was the Butter Battle book. Have either of you read the Butter Battle book?
You mean the nuclear war allegory?
Yes. Might
have, yes.
So the Butter Battle book is about 2 cultures. One butters their bread butter side down, and one butters their bread butter side up, and the 2 of them go head to head and slowly develop larger and larger weapons of mass destruction until they're holding atomic bombs basically over each other, waiting for it to drop after a generation. And this is popularized children's literature that has its own TV show on PBS.
But at the same time, and this is something I think Sapha touched upon when she was talking about what's in the culture, what's accepted, what needs a warning. The Seuss estate has famously recently withdrawn several of its books, 6, I believe, from republication because the content is now something that doesn't reflect the world they want children to come to understand.
Mm-hmm.
One of those, probably the most famous, was To Think That I Saw It on Mulberry Street. Are you familiar with that one?
That was his first one, wasn't it?
I believe it was.
I love that book.
He actually revised it during his lifetime to take the person of Chinese descent, to remove the yellow coloring from the person's body and to change it from a Chinaman to a Chinese person. But even with that modification during Seuss's lifetime, what it's saying about those people and those cultures, and because it's the only way he's presenting them, his estate has decided that it is not helpful for the society in which we now live. And this is a precaution they're taking because of what they want to give to children now.
And I think
whatever we write is going to be very much culture bound, including things like Dr. Seuss's work, including Missing the Boat and Neon Leben.
Yeah.
And the only thing we can anticipate is the things to which we've been exposed.
I think you've definitely, you've got a very big point there. And I think too, though, removing something from a children's market, I'm okay with that, especially material that can be potentially just horrific. And you're looking at it going, let's correct this because that's not okay. We don't want somebody taking, particular examples. But I'm not somebody that believes in destroying everything. Like, I don't believe there should be a pile of books that gets burnt by the end of the day. I believe that we can, academically speaking, learn something from books that were banned, from books that were removed from the cultural ethos, because the second we start losing the context of the past, we're, it's the whole adage of you are doomed to repeat it. I think that while we can remove that kind of thing from children's libraries, we should not forget that book existed. While there are works of fiction and there are people in history which, with our lens today, are incredibly problematic. But if we just completely kind of annihilate them from history or never speak of those people again, then how do we know how to defeat it? I think it kind of goes along with the lines of, if you remove every potentially problematic thing, all those conversations that you could have about how to fix the issue are gone. And then you no longer have any sense of how do you defeat this thing when you come across it. But I do believe in, being like, okay, so you're not reading that book now as a little child, but maybe if you take a literature course on certain things that have happened in the past, we can actually discuss it in an intellectual way. And then by discussing something in a calm-headed manner, we can then kind of demystify and depower it.
Well, and I think that one of the issues that I have with this is that if we don't understand our culture from the past, if we eliminate certain works because there are things in them that aren't necessarily reflective of how we want the world to be or how we want our children to learn. I mean, I don't even remember that part of the book. What I remember about To See Sod on Mulberry Street is a child with a large imagination that's never allowed to share that with a parent because the parent just wants them to be realists. And so they have all of these things that they imagine about the world around them, and then they get home and they're like, oh, I can't talk to my parent about it because they're just going to say, oh, well, that was just a cart and donkey, or you're lying again. And for me to lose that in our culture, to lose an adult telling a child that it's okay to have an imagination, it is hard. That's yeah.
I think we can get ourselves to a place in culture where we can highlight the things that are, good and noble in certain things, and also discuss quite frankly and firmly why certain things were bad. To take the benefits and then to be real about the things that we're like, okay, we don't want that to be what you take away from this. We want this to be. But I'm not somebody that believes in censorship to the point where we kind of annihilate certain things. But I do believe that there are some things that maybe need to be, addressed. And we had this discussion about Son of Abel, because when I wrote it in 2012 through 2014, it's an incredibly different situation than it has been in the last few years. And some of the comments that I got were, well, who are you to mention apartheid and, slavery and things like that as a white woman? And my answer to that was at the time, 15 going on 20 years of nonprofit work and humanitarianism I did in West Africa. Mm-hmm. My family of West African origin, the people in my life that I love, and being able to, from the perspective of a Caucasian person, a person of Caucasian descent, to see that evil, to go, I can't live in that world. I have to keep fighting. And then also to see when it's not our place to fight. We do our bit, we fight, and then when it's time for that justice to happen, we step back so that retribution can be from the group that actually deserves basically to hold that hammer over somebody's head.
I also want to point out there, though, that you do mention about Delilah, who is another character in your book, that she does the humanitarian work in Africa, and she just does just enough, I believe you say, so that people look at her and give her a pass for everything else, because she has proven that she is the good white woman.
Yeah, and I mean, Delilah is
not a protagonist.
No, she's a villain. She's very much a villain. And Delilah is also somebody that's patterned on somebody that I know in real life who does just enough good in the world that all these other things that they do, it's like, oh, well, they're a good person, so you just have to let that pass. But I put that in there because it's a very real thing that happens, because I've seen quite a bit in the nonprofit world and certain situations that I'm not going to talk about on air. But it's a very real and visceral thing. How much is enough for somebody to be labeled a hero or an antagonist? And with somebody like Delilah, in Son of Abel, I leave her a little bit more ambiguous as to where she falls on the scale of good and evil. In Book of Revels, which is the sequel we're working on right now, there's no question.
Yeah.
None at all. None of it. But
no, none of it is way north of there. You're over in BC.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think also that
Greenstone
you brought up a really important thing. As writers, sometimes we are presented with needing to write about characters that, and that's my warning saying that we've got about 10 minutes left. So if anybody in the audience has any questions, please throw them up now, and we'd love to address any questions that you might have on this topic of content warnings. But when we end up writing about characters that are not us, like how can I write about males, or how can I write about, as a cisgender person, someone who is not cisgender, and doing what it takes as a writer to do that properly. And does that fall into this, content warning, or eventually is our work's going to have to be pulled because we are not that demographic, but we are writing these characters?
I think that's a valid point. Like I said it earlier, but with certain situations, especially with that book you were talking about with the visceral sexual violence scenes, if that author has not gone through something like that, what gives them the right to write a book about it? Now, I think of it this way, and this is something that it's actually come up before in our editing streams and just, privately. Obviously, if we wrote just about our single demographic and we only had characters that were exactly like us, it would be a very boring world. And this is fiction. There's almost an easier quality to it the second you say something's a fantasy, because all of a sudden there's less in the real world for it to attach to. But not everybody writes fantasy, so we are going to be writing things within this real world. I think the crux comes, are we writing a story about, like, and I'll use Neon Lieben as an example, one of the main characters, that's Max Allard. He is a mixed race hero of Maori, African, and Caucasian descent, but mostly Maori and African. And am I writing Neon Lieben about his experiences as a man of mixed race in a future time period? No, I'm not writing a novel about that, because I can't. I can't write an entire novel about a subject that I've got nothing. But is it okay for me to write a character, with obviously sensitivity readings, with certain experiences? Is it okay for me to write a character that does not look like me? Well, yes. But you also have to recognize that you have limitations, and that if you're trying to write about a character in a completely different experience than yours, if you don't have people within that experience to, kind of glance the stuff off of, if you don't have a sensitivity reader that's, of a similar culture, then what makes you think that that's the story you should write? Are there not infinite stories you could write within a framework that you authentically understand? And this is a question that came up in another Discord server just this morning, about location. Do you actually physically go to each location that's in your book? And for some people, they're like, I've lived my entire life in one hometown. I can't go to all the places I want to write about. But then the question is, are you writing a book about being a Londoner in the 1980s? Well, then if you were not a Londoner in the 1980s, there's going to be millions of things that you don't have context for, that you cannot write authentically. But if you're writing a book where he ends up in Japan and then 2 pages later they're gone and it's just kind of a passage through, well, then we can do research to the point that's okay, you know?
Google Maps Street
Yeah.
View, anybody.
Yeah, no kidding.
Hey, I read it.
The tourist island in this book, there is no street view. There are like 3 street view pictures.
Oh no.
There's a pandemic. I'm not going to visit the island. Let me see how much reading I can do.
Yeah.
Hey, I write about outer space, so the things exist only in my head. There are galaxies far, far away. We can't even get a Hubble telescope there.
I wrote about the 2155s. You know, like I haven't been there. I don't know. Like I don't know what things are going to look like in 2155, but I can make, educated guesses.
Yeah, I think at least 2 of my content advisories are about things where I have less experience. And yes, I absolutely lean on friends who do have a secondary character whose gender is not my own, whose gender trajectory is not my own. And I was absolutely leaning on the friends to say, look, is it problematic if I say that Lynn is less comfortable trying new restaurants because they have run into enough situations where there was bigotry? Is it harmful to portray their behavior as being limited in that way, or is it just realistic? I think without having someone to lean on for that, I